Welcome to the God's Peculiar People podcast, where we learn about the lives and characteristics of God's people. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to do our book review for the month of April. And I want to start with a little story, I guess. For Christmas this past year, I got a Kindle. And now this is not the first Kindle or ebook reader that I have ever had. My first one was actually one of those early Nooks that Barnes & Noble sold, that you could only get books on it that were from Barnes & Noble. They're a little annoying, and then they're all tied to the book. You can't read them on anything else. We won't go there. I still have it somewhere, but if it still works some 10 years later is probably highly unlikely, especially since I haven't charged it in probably 2 years, so that's a problem. But being an avid reader, I was opposed to ebooks when they first started to appear. In my mind, I was like, who wants to read a book without feeling the pages, smelling the paper and ink, and having to figure out where you dropped your bookmark? That happened to me all the time. But I was semi-converted out of necessity. In the year 2013, I got my first Nook. And I got it because I was about to leave the US for a year to go to West Africa. And there was no possible way I could pack enough books with me for a year. So the Nook became my new best friend. Now, I don't recall how many books I loaded onto the device, but Project Gutenberg, big fan of that place, that website. I downloaded a ton of books from there. I bought quite a few books from Barnes & Noble through their Nook store. I downloaded all of the free books that I could find, and I do remember, though I don't remember how many books I had, I do remember that I had to add an SD card so that I could extend the e-reader's capacity. Many an early morning, and often late into the night, I would sit reading with the glow of the Nook on my face, the sounds of the West African village wafting up the hill to my ears. 10 years later now, I have a new device, and one of the first books I downloaded was 50 People Every Christian Should Know, Learning from Spiritual Giants of the Faith by Warren Wiersbe. Reading about people's lives has always fascinated me. Most of the books that I read or listen to as audiobooks today are biographies of people's lives and experiences. I enjoy reading and listening to stories about people climbing Mount Everest, going on long adventures, or just how people in politics have lived their lives. Also, seeing as how this podcast is about people, seeing a book containing information about 50 different people's lives, for me, was very exciting. Now, there's something that I want to make clear about this book, 50 People Every Christian Should Know, before we get too far along, and it's that this book was previously published as 2 separate books. Part of it was originally titled Living with the Giants, published in 1993. The other part was published in 1984 as Victorious Christians You Should Know, but the 2 books were combined as one volume in 2009. So let me tell you a little bit about this book, after I've told you about how much I love reading about people. 50 People Every Christian Should Know in the ebook format contains 380 pages, and it is published by Baker Books. Hi listeners, I'm interrupting myself for just a minute to remind you about a way you can help support the show. We have an Etsy store with printable memory cards, lesson materials, Bible reading plans, and much more. And for the month of April, we are giving you, our listeners, 25% off of everything in the store. All you have to do is add the items to your cart and use code APRIL25, that's April25, at checkout. The code will be valid through April 30th, 2023. Now, back to the show. So the people Wiersbe wrote about are preachers, teachers, and missionaries. It begins with Catherine von Bora, and the entries are listed in order of the year in which each person was born, ending with William Culbertson. As I was reading, I was trying to figure out why the people were listed in, what was the significance of how he listed them, and it wasn't until I looked at the table of contents and saw the dates of each birth that I realized that was the order. Which is awesome. Good way to do it. Now, one of the things I found most useful about this book is the extensive list of biographies that Wiersbe mentions. I believe that for every entry, every person, Wiersbe mentions at least one biography the reader should pick up to learn more about each person. And I found this to be very helpful. There are just so many biographies out there, and with the average cost of novels being $13.95 to $17.95, purchasing biographies can add up quickly. But he did a good job of listing a biography for people who just want to learn a little bit about the person, and then biographies or books that gave a more extensive view of the person. So that's very helpful to have, and a great way to go back and look and highlight those books. Now, something else to consider when looking for biographies is to search for them as PDFs. Now, if the person you want to read about lived prior to the 1920s, it is possible that some of the biographies or autobiographies may be in the public domain, and someone may have put them online in PDF format, or they're in the National Archives. Many biographies have gone out of print, and many probably will never be reprinted, so searching the digital archives may pop up some of the biographies you want to read. The book I read last summer about Mary Slessor, and the book we'll be reading this summer, it will be about D.L. Moody, hint for you there, were both in the public domain and are available as PDF downloads. So make sure you check different online resources to read the books. Now, I have to admit I would prefer to have books in the physical form, but as a way to be able to read about these people's lives, having the ability to access books that are out of print in a PDF format is amazing, and highly recommend you go and look for these books rather than spending a fortune on them. Try to find a PDF download. It will be worth the effort to try to find them. Now, the other thing that I found very helpful is that Wiersbe listed the works that the people wrote, with suggestions as to which ones to read first to whet your appetite, and which ones to read if you wanted to dive in deeper to the works that they did. Now, the subtitle for the book is Learning from the Spiritual Giants of the Faith, and this helps to explain who Wiersbe wrote about and why. Anytime you try to create a list of who you need to know, it can be difficult to narrow down that field. Many of the people in Wiersbe's books would be known to the average Christian. Names like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, Hudson Taylor, Fanny Crosby, Charles Spurgeon, and D.L. Moody. But also contained in the pages of this book are people who we are less likely to have learned about, such as Charles Spurgeon's son, Thomas Spurgeon. That's right, in this book you will learn about Charles Spurgeon's children. I did not know that Spurgeon had twin sons, Charles and Thomas. And due to poor health, Thomas Spurgeon moved to Australia and then later to New Zealand for the change of climate. The name Spurgeon opened up doors for him, and while by trade and training Thomas was an engraver, when people heard the name Spurgeon, he was often asked to preach. He had some ability, and wherever he preached, he drew a crowd. Following his father's death, Thomas was asked to come and preach at his father's church. He came and remained the pastor of the Metropolitan Tabernacle for 14 years. Another person Wiersbe writes about is Amy Carmichael. Now, his opening statement about Amy Carmichael is, quote, "Let me describe some of the things she did, and then allow you to answer the question. If she was a missionary from your church, would you support Amy Carmichael?" End quote. Now, this is rather a less than complimentary start to discuss Amy Carmichael, and though it is true her methods were viewed as unorthodox at the time and still might be considered slightly unorthodox today, she did accomplish much in her nearly 60 years in the mission field. The remainder of the chapter on Amy Carmichael improves in tone about her life, but this is a good reminder to read more about her methods. With the dawn of her fellowship Amy founded, she was the ruling power. Was this appropriate? Was she the best person to handle all of the daily and ministerial affairs? Should she have delegated more? Those are questions for you to answer as you read more about the life and work of Amy Carmichael. In addition to the many names I did know in the book, I found a few that were new to me, such as R.W. Dale, William Culbertson, Christmas Evans, etc. But that's what makes these types of books so enjoyable. You are reminded of people you already know something about, but you are also introduced to new people that you may or may not be interested in learning more about. Now, I don't want to spoil the book for anyone, which is why I have difficulty knowing what to say and how much to say about a book, but I highly recommend reading 50 People Every Christian Should Know. If you're using a Kindle, the book is, at the time of this recording, available in the Kindle Unlimited plan, so for Kindle readers, make sure you take advantage of that, because you get to read it for free. Or for the monthly subscription price. You get the idea. Recently, I learned that we have 20 plus people following the podcast on Spotify, and I want to thank you so much for following along. That is very exciting, and while I try to stay away from overly promoting the show, I would be grateful if you would share the podcast with others and leave a comment about what you think about the show. We would enjoy hearing what you enjoy about the show, and you could let us know someone you would like to hear something about on the show. But that's it for today. We'll be back next Wednesday for another episode of the God's Peculiar People podcast. We'll talk to you then.